the pleasure of serving as the director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the first event of the spring term in the Critical Issues Confronting China series. Before I begin with introducing today's illustrious speakers, let me just say a little bit more about this series for those of you who are just joining us at Harvard this spring, and also for those of you who are joining us for the first time online. This series was one that was begun by Phil Overholt, who's sitting over here. Phil, will you please give a good wave? Who is with the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as the late Ezra Vogel, as well as Bill Shao. And they began this series as an effort to examine some of the critical issues confronting China in contemporary times, and a chance for us to really sort of dive deep on each of these issues week by week. So we'll be having one of these events every week for spring term for the next 8 weeks, with the exception of spring break. This series is now organized by myself, Bill, and then also Dinda Elliott. Dinda, will you give a wave? I think many of you know Dinda. She serves as the executive director for the Fairbanks Center. But we have the pleasure of taking this series and driving it forward. And what I wanted to say is next week we'll be trying something for the first time since we've brought the series back in person. Those of you who follow this series know that during the pandemic, we organized several online sessions. In fact, it was only online. But one of the things we learned from the online sessions was that this really offered an opportunity to draw on a broader array of speakers. And while we certainly have appreciated having the in-person events, which allowed for a lot of the informal interactions, and we're delighted that Margaret Pearson is with us here today as an example of that, it also has meant that we have not had the chance, especially given the travel restrictions, to have as many Chinese speakers in the series. So next week's session will be at 9:00 a.m. It will feature Ma Jun, and it will focus on China's environmental targets. So I just want to make a note for those of you who regularly tune in for this event at 12 o'clock Eastern, that next week we'll have an early start. And for those of you who come in person, to please join us again online. And then the week following, we'll be back in person again. So I just wanted to make that announcement. So with that, let me introduce our speakers today. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Margaret Pearson, who is the Horace and Wilma Harrison Distinguished Professor and a Distinguished Scholar and Teacher in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. Dr. Pearson's research is one that I think many of you know and follow. She focuses on China's domestic politics, including looking at state control of the economy, central-local relations, and she also focuses on the interplay between the domestic to local economy and China's foreign policy. In fact, many of her projects have focused on looking at how should we conceptualize China's behavior overseas, and that, of course, is going to be the focus of today's talk. She's done some really groundbreaking work with our discussant today, Professor Meg Rithmeyer from the Harvard Business School. The two of them, along with Kelly Tsai, another professor based in Hong Kong, have really sort of looked at this phenomenon of how we should look at what China is doing overseas. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it already, I'd recommend to you their recent article in Foreign Affairs entitled The New China Shock, which touches on some of those issues. Professor Pearson received her PhD in political science from Yale. She was an associate professor at Dartmouth for many years before she moved to the University of Maryland. She's had several books. I won't go through the whole list, but the most recent one being China's Strategic Multilateralism, which is available through Cambridge University Press and came out shortly before the pandemic. So with that, Professor Pearson, welcome, welcome back, I should say, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to be here and see a lot of people I haven't seen in quite a long time. So it's wonderful in this new building also, which is coming from University of Maryland. This looks just terrific. Okay, is this good? Okay, great. So, and thank you, Mark, for inviting me, and I'm delighted that Kelly's gonna, not Kelly. This is how close the three of us work together. That Meg is here to stir up some trouble for me, I'm sure. So I want to focus on some research that I've done with several different collaborative groups on China's overseas economic activities and some of the reactions that it has gotten. One of those projects, as Mark said, is with Meg and Kelly, and Kelly has given me. Meg has given me oh my God, Meg has given me leave today to not talk about that project, but we certainly can do that in the Q&A. I want to talk about basically the question of how we understand how much influence China's economic activities have overseas. Now, some of you may be fans of the TV show South Park. There is an episode, fairly famous episode of South Park from a few years ago, featuring the Underpants Gnomes. Now, the Underpants Gnomes basically were cute little gnomes that went out and decided to steal everybody's underpants so they could get their hands on, surreptitiously, of course. And the plan was somehow they're going to make a lot of profit out of this. So when somebody asked, the head gnome here, what is it that you're going to do in order to get profit out of these stolen underpants? He said, well, there's this phase 2, and we don't really know what's going to happen in there, but we'll work it out as we go forward. And I often think of discussions of China's overseas economic influence as having some similarity to this underpants gnomes situation, because there tends to be, particularly in Washington, a sense that as China does stuff and it leads them to control the world, but exactly how it gets from controlling economic flows to ruling the world is not very clear. So the strands of research that I want to talk about with you today really are to sort of look a little bit more at that phase 2. It's not a simple story of what happens in phase 2. There are many different problems and answers that are being generated by researchers out there, but I wanted to share with you some that I'm doing with various colleagues. So just to set the table a little bit, my colleague at Maryland, Scott Kastner, and I have done some thinking about how to think about what we call the logic chain of economic influence. And here, it seems to make sense to divide this chain into sort of 2 chunks. One is sort of what the sender does. And so in this sense, what China is doing, what China both intends to do and the tools it may use in order to follow up on its intentions for overseas. The other side is what we call the receiver side, which is the idea that basically, unless you're going to rely completely on coercion to get what you want, then you somehow have to bring others to you. It has to be some kind of reaction from the other side, the subject of, or the target of influence. And so today it's this second part that I really want to talk about, not so much the intentions or the tools of statecraft, but rather what happens on the recipient side. And again, just in a very, very simplistic way, it does make sense to understand that there can be, unlike the underpants gnomes idea, there can be many different outcomes to the input or to the outflow of China's economic activities. So on the left here, you see this possibility that if we think of alignment with China's interests, let's say in other countries or by people in other countries, we can imagine that the alignment with China's interests can be low or high. This is on the y-axis. And we can imagine that, let's say a country's leaders are going on with making policies that, are fairly neutral toward China, neither good nor bad. If we think of these economic interventions not in the normative sense, but just, the scientific sense, like something happens, that we can imagine influence is likely to have occurred if the alignment increases. On the other hand, we can imagine that influence has not occurred, and indeed backlash may have occurred if the line, right-hand chart, decreases following the intervention. And then finally, we can imagine that influence doesn't happen at all, in the sense that interventions make no difference in what a country does. So we have to be open to all of those possibilities. And this is not easy to figure out. It's not easy to do. Influence has a lot of nagging measurement problems that scholars have tried to deal with, either through sort of case study process tracing, that's just the project that Meg and I have worked on, or through some other fancy mechanisms, or through regressions and attempts to identify mechanisms. But the mechanisms may vary. They may vary with context, right? So the kinds of mechanisms that might lead to an influence outcome, positive, negative, or neutral, in one setting may be very different from those in another setting. And so with that sort of brief table setting, I wanted to go through some of the studies that I've been involved with. Actually, I'm going to reference 4 studies that look at this question of influence in very different they look at this question of influence in different ways, or asking somewhat different questions. The first study really tries to focus on whether states' policies in the recipient country align with China's interests, or create backlash, or indeed cause no change, sort of the state interest level or the state policy level. The other 3 papers that I want to mention are whether China's economic activities overseas shape popular opinion in the recipient countries, or we might think of this: do they win hearts and minds? And that focuses on work in Africa. So on this first question of whether China's overseas economic activities align a state's interests with China's interests, there are existing studies out there. Bob Ross and I were mentioning a couple of these to each other a minute ago. Some of them simply look at the impact of trade ties with China on recipient states' policies, and meaning trade specifically, and they provide mixed results. Right, there's not a clear set of results there. Another set of articles, or type of article that's become popular very recently, is that economic ties cause a country to vote as China votes in the UN General Assembly. And more often with this kind of study, they're finding some convergence of state interests with with China's voting pattern. Now here, and we can talk about this in the Q&A if you'd like, the dependent variable is highly problematic, and there are problems with assuming that voting as China does in the UN General Assembly tells you much about whether countries are really following China. So with Scott Kastner and our graduate student Guan Wang, we are looking at this question of alignment of states' interests in the context of a couple of very recent high-profile situations, and ask, are countries with greater economic ties to China more supportive of China's interests on the Hong Kong national security law and on the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang? And this is an interesting case in the sense that generally within the context of the UN, when there's been strong controversy about these 2 topics, some countries, largely either the US or Europe, have tried to organize other countries to sign letters that say we oppose China's policies here. And on the other hand, China has worked hard to organize countries to say we agree with China. So we call this sort of the dueling letters. And the cases allow us to see variation as to whether countries are willing to sign on to letters on one side or the other, and then understand what are the characteristics of the countries, whether they're signing on to support or oppose China. Or as I'll say in a little bit, there are a lot of countries that remain silent on these issues as well. And so what's going on with them? So the basic conclusion, I don't have a nice little chart to show the results here, but the basic conclusions are that trade reduces criticism of China in both of these cases, but it doesn't really increase support of China. So if you trade a lot with China, you are not likely to be supportive of China, but you're probably more likely to be silent. Investment has a slightly different outcome. It increases active support for China. So if you have more investments from China, you are more likely to, countries are more likely to actively support or sign on to letters supporting China. So we would, gently suggest that investment is a stronger influence, has a stronger influence effect than trade does. And as expected, smaller sample size, because not all countries receive foreign aid from China and not all countries sign on to the BRI. These countries that are either aid recipients or BRI signatories are weakly correlated with support for China. Not absolutely correlated with support for China, but there's a weak correlation there. The other finding worth mentioning, though, is that economic ties in general are much weaker predictors than some of the other variables that we looked at that have to do with non-economic factors. Right? So the factors of whether a country is a democracy, whether it scores high on a VDEM scale, for example, or whether it is wealthy, has high per capita income, is a much more likely predictor of whether a country is likely to sign on or oppose. And so, as you might guess, sort of wealthy democratic OECD countries are much more likely to oppose China, and those who are poorer and often have lower polyarchy scores are less likely to sign on. So there's some suggestive evidence there, right? I think we went into this thinking that economic ties really might not have much influence at all, impact at all. We were a little surprised that it had some influence, but it's not sort of as strong as this idea that my students come into my class and say to me, well, China's buying Africa, but with aid, it's not strong in that way. There's some weak evidence. Okay, the other question that we're exploring in ongoing work is really whether what it is for countries to remain silent and why they might remain silent. And some might say, well, just like during the Ukraine war, efforts to get countries to condemn Russia or not, or support Russia's invasion, you see a lot of countries saying, well, we don't want to get involved. So that may be one reason for silence. But we also suspect that there may be other additional reasons for, in this case, which is signing letters for on the Hong Kong national security law or on Xinjiang might generate silent reaction. Okay, so there's a second strand of type of study that I've been involved with, this time with my colleague John Macaulay, who is a specialist in African politics, and also Shannon Wang, who now is professor at Baruch College and in the China of the World postdoc program. And here we've tried to explore whether China's overseas economic activities shape popular opinion in these in other countries. And here we've focused on Africa. We largely for reasons of data, and also because my Africanist colleague can understand these things better than I can. We've used Afrobarometer surveys, which are carried out with large numbers of respondents every couple of years. And we've used a database from the Financial Times called FDI Markets to look at projects. And these, both the respondents and the projects we have geolocated, and we're trying to understand really how, several things. Does living close to an FDI project from China affect how people feel about two things: their own government, and affect how they feel about this so-called China model of development. So in this first issue, how do they feel about their own government? Here, the tie to influence is a little bit more circuitous, right? Because you would say, well, you're just saying, how do people rate their own government if they live near Chinese investment projects? But here, the logic is that very often when a project is started, when it's announced, there will be a lot of, as in any country, there will be a lot of efforts by politicians to say, okay, we're bringing this project to our community, and it's going to create jobs, and it's going to do great things, and please reward me with your voters' support is the idea. And so the thinking you would guess of politicians is that, oh, well, I'm going to bring these Chinese projects, and when they create jobs, that's going to win me support. And then you might imagine that the politicians would be more likely to want to continue this gravy train and align their interests with China's interests. So the main finding that we have from this paper, which is in Journal of Politics from earlier this year, is that people looking at how they rate their own country's economic conditions and how they rate their own political leaders. They basically, when a project is announced, are very excited about it, right? They rate the prospects for their economy, their current economic conditions, and the competence of their leaders higher. However, after the project is implemented, which can be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, the support for their own leadership decreases, right? And at the bottom, if you could read it, I give you a little bit of information about the data that I won't go over. And we say this disappointment with the outcomes at the point of implementation is, we dub it unmet expectations. So this is just a simple slide to show that the bottom axis is distance to a Chinese investment project. So if you're within 50 kilometers, then you are at the time of announcement of the project, especially if you're very close to it, likely to be very excited about your domestic economic conditions. And that as you get farther away, it goes away. This is a project announcement. But at the time when the project becomes operational, if this is, basically neutral, attitudes have turned quite sour. And we have a fairly involved methodology to control for endogeneity and so forth that I would refer you to the paper, or we can talk about it later. But basically, this is suggesting that over cases collected from 1999 to 2018 are the respondents, and we have data from, I think, 2003 of projects to also 2018. We find this to be a pretty robust finding. But we don't find the same for foreign aid, right? So this is, again, intriguing. The top, without spending too much time on this, the top, if you look, we just focus here for our attention, and that's the chart I showed you there. For foreign investment, this is the pattern that I just showed you. Announced projects are at the top here, active projects are at the bottom. You see this decline in support. But for aid, you find basically that as aid projects are announced, people feel okay about it, but as it becomes implemented and out to a longer period of time, people remain excited about their country's economic conditions. So that's one kind of tidbit of finding. A second project looks directly at how respondents to the Afrobarometer survey in one round, that's the only time it was asked in round 6, around 2014, 2015, were asked whether they like the China model of development. Now here, things get a little murky because we can't, we didn't carry out the survey, and we can't say to respondent, this is what the China model of development is, or what do you think the China model of development is? They're just asked about their views of the China model of development. So there's some fuzziness here in that question and how we can analyze it. But nevertheless, what we find is that, we theorize that popular attitudes about China's activities in Africa are informed by the actual experiences that people have with their economic presence, and that these should be stronger, closer to the project itself. And so what we find is that proximity to Chinese investment reduces support for a China model of development. So proximity here being that side is close, this side is far, up to 200 kilometers away. We find that basically people are much less likely to respond that they think the China model of development is good for their country, closer by they are. So I think an important broader question when looking at China's impact overseas is to really wonder, is this because of China? Is this China qua China? Or is this something about the investment being a foreign investment, right? A function of foreign direct investment more generally. And so my dream is to actually do a lot of different studies looking at a lot of different countries and sort of comparing what we find for China. That will take a lot of time and more money than I have. But we did carry out this same team, Macaulay Wong and I are currently preparing a paper where we are looking at the responses of African citizens proximate to both US investment projects and to Chinese investment. And so we ask two similar questions. How does proximity to US and Chinese FDI affect the perceived how does it affect your perception of influence of China and the US as models? And the second question is, basically, do you like these models, right? Do you like what you see? And on the question of which is more influential, we find that, and here, I'm sorry, with the font is too small, that side is close to US investment, this side is close to Chinese investment. It's divided into two halves here, so it's a little bit complicated because US, our hunch is that if a investment project, let's say by China, is set up in a certain place, people may respond to that project, but they also may be colored in their views by other projects from other countries, right? So there may be co-location of Chinese and US investment projects. It is much more likely for US projects to not have any Chinese projects around them, to have much less co-location. It's much more common that Chinese projects, when they go in, either because they're newer, maybe mainly because they're newer, they're more likely to also have US projects around them. So the top half is looking at when they're close to any US or Chinese foreign investment, and the bottom half is when they're only close to the investment of either the US or to China. So sorry about that complication. But basically what we find is that I think, as you would expect, people who are located closer to US investments think the US is more powerful country, more influential country, right? And that holds whether they're close to all US or close to just US. For China, I think our theory going in was that because there's so much more co-location by Chinese projects, they would, this idea that China would have more influence would kind of be offset by the fact of the US also having projects there. And that's in fact a more muted finding for China that we find on the right there, that Chinese FDI increases China's perceived influence, but it's offset by co-location with US investment. Now, to me, this is the most fun finding, which is, is China the best model of development for your country? And again, I would just focus here on the bottom half, although the findings are consistent for the top half and the bottom up here. And what we find is that for people who are living close to Chinese investment, if you ask them, is the Chinese model the best model for your country? The answer is basically no. And if you ask them, is the US model the best model for your country? The answer is yes. At the same time, if you ask people living close to US investment, is US model the best model for your country? If you're living near US investment project, is the US model the best for your country? And they're like, yes, the US is better. So I have dubbed this the proximity breeds contempt theory of foreign direct investment. So just two little points to conclude. It is certainly possible, I think, that some of the reaction that we're finding, particularly in the global South, to Chinese projects, at least in terms of how people assess the questions that we ask, do you like the model or not, that these may be more related to foreignness, right, rather than related to China per se. And there's another incident or another example in the United States that kind of shows this phenomenon as well. So you may remember a few years ago, I'm going to be fuzzy on the details, but a few years ago, either Trump was president or I think it was probably early in the Trump administration in Wisconsin, Foxconn said they were going to build a major big plant, right, to do something. I don't remember what it was, to do something. And it got a lot of attention from the current governor who was going to be running for re-election. And President Trump visited and said how great this was. And, there wasn't a lot of time. I'm sure everybody in this room knows that Foxconn is a Taiwanese company. I don't think that the relationship to Taiwan was particularly relevant here at all. That's my guess, it's not. But anyway, it got a lot of attention, right? The new way new projects do. And this guy who has his own little prop plane has taken it upon himself to every month or so fly around the project and sort of say, what's happened? And this has become the Foxconn Ariel's Twitter feed. And if you go through, it's been now several years, where you basically find that nothing has happened and nothing has happened and nothing has happened. And at some point, Foxconn said, well, we're going to like pull back. We're going to make something like simpler. We're going to have a data center and we're going to employ a lot fewer people. And now some construction is going along, right? But you have political leaders saying this is great for your community, but you have lack of progress on it. And I don't have popular opinion data to say that now people, don't, like their president or don't like, although Trump was voted out. And the governor of Wisconsin was also not very good as well. So maybe that's all the data you need. But anyway, this suggests to me that maybe there's a phenomenon here that is less related to China per se than to other kinds of investment. And there are other people, whenever I talk about this, people will come up with examples of their own. The last point I want to make is that, if you pay attention to Washington politics now, you'll know that one of the recent pushes has been to say, okay, now we're going to go and set up development programs in Africa. So the U.S. has a very, very long-standing aid program in Africa, very successful, focused on public health that routinely wins it very, very high marks for a lot of the work that is done. But they've now said, well, no, we're going to start, building factories and maybe doing some infrastructure, but, we're going to set up these public-private partnerships to go to Africa. And although the Biden administration has been much more quiet about saying it's because we want to compete with China in Africa, that's clearly the subtext here. And so what some of our findings would suggest that it may not redound to the benefit of the U.S. government necessarily to go in this way to be competing with China, regardless of how well we do it. It may not, in fact, win the hearts and minds of citizens if indeed people located near what you're doing don't like what you're doing anyway. So that's a lot, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so first let me thank Margaret for coming all the way up for no reason other than to give a talk here. And also Mark for convening us and Bill and Linda and others. So since Mark's introduction gave me a kind of entryway, let me first say something a little bit about the joint work that Margaret and I have been doing with Kelly Tai from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And Mark was very gracious to point out the article we have in Foreign Affairs, which is based on a paper that came out in International Security last fall, so the more academic version and then the easier to digest version, I suppose. And then we have a little book, we call it, coming out in a couple of months with Cambridge University Press Element Series on China's specific political economic model. So the argument that we make both about China's model and about backlash is that China's model evolved over time, especially under Xi Jinping, but we don't think that Xi Jinping is the primary factor driving that evolution. Margaret will correct me if I get anything wrong here, toward a model of kind of state capitalism that was focused on state intervention and competition in globalized sectors, to a model which we call party state capitalism, which is much more focused on the role of the party state in society, risk prevention and management, and the politics of retaining the CCP's monopoly on political control. And so we have this kind of work that's very much focused on how that looks in China and the causes of that in China and the manifestations of it, which we identify in terms of corporate governance, in terms of securitization, a suite of laws that gave the party state, including the national security law, which Margaret cited in her slides, but also the cyber security law, the national intelligence law, which give the party state a wide legal foundation to intervene in the affairs of firms of all types of ownership within China. So looking at the evolution of that is kind of half of our research agenda, and the other half has been looking at the international backlash that it generated. And there, unlike the kind of empirical terrain that Margaret's talk just focused on, which is really on China in the developing world and specifically in Africa, we've looked at OECD countries, so advanced industrial democracies ranging from Australia to Europe and the United States. And our argument there, which I think is interestingly in contradiction a little bit with some of your findings, and I wanted to kind of offer that up as a response to see if we can explore it a bit, is that it's actually the content. So the change is, is a temporal change. So in a sense, the West was willing to tolerate and even welcome Chinese investment and Chinese economic interdependence until China's model shifted to one in which the party state had so much control and shifted its goals, or was perceived to have shifted its goals and capabilities in a way that made Chinese firms suspect to the U.S. government and to many OECD governments. And so instead of interdependence, so our paper is called From Interdependence to Insecurity. So instead of generating interdependence, generating prosperity and the feeling of economic entanglement that generates peace between many countries, it generates insecurity. And to my chagrin, in a way, we wrote this, and then Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, immediately gives a speech at MIT that says basically exactly that. In the 90s, we thought that economic interdependence would be great for peace and prosperity and for everything, and now we think it's a source of insecurity. And so, in a sense, I guess we're right about that. But in any case, or at least we're right, and we're explaining what US policymakers think. The Chinese view of that would be that it's really about China's rise, and the US wants to contain China's rise, and they don't care about the China model at all. And so what's interesting about, I think, our work is that we're very focused on the content of the China model and how the specific organization of state, economy, and society have been received internationally. Whereas at the risk of being a little bit provocative, I feel like I could go through your slides and do a find and replace China with France, and it'd be the same set of questions, right? How do you feel about French involvement? And then your conclusion is that it's really foreignness rather than Chineseness that seems to be driving a lot of the backlash. And so I thought I would ask you, I'm curious what you think and what your colleagues think. Africans, for example, think the China model is, right? When they say they like or don't like it, or they find it influential or not influential. Has it changed over time? Are those changes relevant? And, and to think a little bit about whether, China's overseas economic influence does or does not depend on how it organizes its own economy and politics internally. And so that's sort of about the national security law and the Xinjiang question. What do people think of China doing that? And I guess I get from your conclusion, you might think of things like whether it's a, Muslim majority country, that it would matter a lot, right? And you're telling me it does matter whether they have polyarchy and openness, right? And so in a sense, and this is my last provocation, the Biden administration has carried forward really the Trump administration's view that it's really a fight between democracy and authoritarianism, right? And there are many within the China community who kind of bristle at that and say, don't talk about just the regime type, right? Talk about the behaviors that the CCP has taken. But in a way, do you think that's basically right? That the regime type matters a lot. And if Africans were thinking about the China model versus the American model, are they thinking primarily of regime type, or do you think they're thinking of something else? Or is the question kind of beyond the scope?
Oh, it's beyond the scope. Next, no.
Easy.
Yeah, no, these are very good. One of the things I've been trying to do, and that was interesting for me of putting these slides together, was to see the sort of try to weave them together. It is not only because of lack of time that I don't know how to weave this quite in. I think there are contradictions between these different kinds of findings, right? So if I were to say, what do people in Africa think of the China model? Well, when people have suggested what people in Africa think of the China model, I think it happens on two levels. One is we see a country coming in and investing, and it maybe does some good things like create jobs, and maybe it creates externalities like environmental degradation. And that's what our theory is, that's what people are thinking about, right? And the thing that we haven't looked at, but I would think is very interesting also to follow up on, is that very often now, probably because of the international branding, meddling of China and the US in Africa, there is an attempt to say, make this a political football, right? And so what you see, as in Sri Lanka, the case very well, you see that as the immediate reaction to the projects may exist on the one hand, you also see an overlying political reaction, which is an incumbent does business with China, and a person trying to defeat them will say, "Oh, you're doing business with China bad, China authoritarian. You should vote this person out because they're corrupt, and probably there is corruption involved, and so forth and so on." So you see this political dynamic that weaves itself in here as well, which is in some ways much closer to what we find in the U.S. and Europe. Not to say that that's just simply a political dynamic, but a huge part of the backlash, I think, that we see in our study has to do with a lot of the way the politics has been framed around it, right? So I guess the short answer would be, I don't know that if you take in the global South countries that have not been deeply globalized and haven't had maybe have had a more ambivalent view about globalization and haven't sort of put their a lot of stock into this idea of China engagement, then you don't have that overlying kind of political narrative that we have been having in the U.S. Now, I think a lot of that is coming to Africa in certain countries. You see it specifically, but I think the political context is a little bit different there. I don't think people are thinking that much about authoritarianism, honestly. I will say, though, that if you look at this is sort of beyond the scope of what I've studied as just a casual observer. If you sort of look at the messaging in Africa by China, which I think is much more committed to that messaging to within the press and so forth than the US is committed to messaging. You know, they're sort of very much downplaying this idea of that authoritarianism or democracy matters, right? You know, so that my interpretation with the Ukraine war and the support of Russia in the Ukraine war was you saw a lot of Chinese diplomats saying, you know, you can easily just say it's not our business, right? And we don't want to get involved. And so therefore trying to create this space to move it away from this authoritarianism versus democracy dilemma. So.
Just add one quick thing, which is I learned yesterday that just with the messaging, that in fact, Chinese media companies have been taking large stakes in African media companies. I don't know if you've heard that, which is also a really fascinating one. So, can I have a question? Is it okay? Okay, so I'll just ask when you raise your hand, please just introduce yourself and we'll take one at a time. I think we have enough. So we'll just do it like a normal human conversation instead of these academic speedish things, but let me know. So I'll go to Bill first, but do introduce yourself.
Right about we train people to wait for them.
Yeah. Down here, Bill.
Yeah.
I'll introduce him in the interest of time. So Bill's our co-convener here. And
Pearson, in fact, is very valuable. It raises several questions, which is unfair for me to put on the table, but suppose you hold FBI from the US and China constant. Take a bunch of countries with no FDI from either China or the US. So, what do you think of the US model and the China model and divide it? System and relatively autocratic system that would provide a baseline. And I have a feeling that a lot of the countries that are democratic, like Albania, you get a very negative reaction right now to the US model. A range of reactions to the Chinese model. But so my question is, does your work shed any light on that baseline, and could you use and apply it holding the FBI concept, and would that potentially shine a different light on?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think a sub question that you're getting at is the suggestion that history matters a whole lot, right? History with a particular country matters. History in a country with US or China matters a lot, right?
Also system structure.
And system.
You assume democratic countries are happy with the democratic model.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm not, I mean, you know, because there's so many different, you know, the range of what is democratic and the range of what authoritarianism, and the fact that most of them lumped together somewhere in the middle, it would make it very, very hard. You'd have to, you know, use some kind of metric of level of polyarchy or whatever to get at that. I mean, what I would need is something to substitute for investment, right? That you could really sort of locate in a particular way in order to use the methodology that we used. What I think is what I'd love to see somebody do beyond just regular opinion polling in these countries is to sort of get their head around probably qualitatively get their head around how opinions have are changing as you see the entrance of the sort of impact of China's rise in the world, sort of on people's consciousness, right? And also as you see this narrative of China's rise, U.S. decline, or great power competition, as you see that sort of filtering into countries, sort of whether that creates a change in how people view one or the other. So off the top of my head, I can't think of a way to address that directly, but I think that there are certainly great questions in there that I'm guessing to be satisfying would have to be teased out qualitatively. Yeah.
Okay, up here, right behind you, right there. Make sure to introduce yourself. Yeah.
Interesting talk. Jigong from Beijing Institute. These issues are very, very important. I have two questions. First one is the response. Do you see the response differs across different African countries? I mean, when they compare to their own countries. So this is a general response. Just is there any variations? My second one is, do you see any difference between those who actually participated in those US or China projects or compared to general African citizens? They just live nearby. So do you see the projects being those people? So my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jia. So on the first question, we do not have any country-specific information, which is, we considered doing that for a while. We also don't sort of have region like East Africa, Southern Africa, Horn of Africa kinds of information. If you look at the pattern of where these projects are, generally, so you'll see that there's a pattern, right, of greater concentration in some places that it's expected, right? It's true of both. It's you can't really see it on this map, but it's true of both U.S. and Chinese FDI. They do tend to, concentrate in certain areas. I think it would be fascinating to go back to Bill's question. If you were to look, since you would have some of the same questions from Afrobarometer in some of these surveyed areas. So the blank areas don't have any questions asked, but in these grayish areas where you're not around anything, and to really sort of do some analysis where there is no project, you might reveal some kind of variance there. And yes, so there certainly are a lot of people who are looking, who are interviewing, doing field work of people who are involved in projects themselves, and there are often media reports of people who are involved in projects themselves, and you find a variation as well, sometimes based on sector. I do think that this political football trend, right, where you have local media, sometimes invested by China, and sometimes stringers for Western media, you have a fair amount of media competition, and you have stories that are being told from all sides about, either this company is great to work for and I've got benefits and or, my bosses are beating me up. You see a great range of kind of individual responses, but that's not the sort of thing that we have looked at. There's the China Africa Research Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where you see a lot of papers put out sort of that are more case studies, have some really, really nice sort of qualitative cases that will suggest, shed some more light on that. Yeah. But I don't think there's a standard single answer.
Thank you so much for this. I think such a really nice thing. Extreme harm in the school and in Brazil City. So, question. So the first question is when you talk about FDI, we look at not only green investment as the one of the people we work. We also look at the money position. I think the communication actually mentioned that the Chinese media company work on file many instructions. So in your research, you basically cover so only green one.
The data set is only greenfield investments. Yeah. Mhm.
Because the entity people so I actually in recent years we have more and more for yes investment communication. So let the impact of the local people perception of Chinese investment. I'm not sure whether it is because it was only investment of thank you.
Mhm. Right. That is interesting. You know, and the M&A, I should probably leave that to Meg to answer. The one question I would wonder about is, you know, if you're having a takeover of an existing company, is the does it so let's say it's an African company taken over by a Chinese company, is the brand or the visibility, does it remain African, or does the identity, I guess you would say, remain African, or is there a big hoopla made about a Chinese company taking it over? I think our research kind of depends on the idea that citizens have some sense of what the identity of that company is. And in greenfield investments, there's much more of a sense of what the identity of the U.S. company or the Chinese company. I'm not sure that you would find that same thing in takeovers.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. The dispute resolution is also really interesting. I wish I knew who was.
Yeah, I don't know anything about this. So thank you.
Dispute resolutions, but just on M&As, you know, it's very interesting in the data. I mean, the data we have on Chinese projects abroad tend to focus actually on greenfield rather than M&A. That's the way, because those are the companies people are interested in, because most people are interested only in Chinese SOEs or in infrastructure investment, right? But there's a whole world of what Chinese companies are doing that's actually quite interesting, and about which we actually have better data because M&A requires reporting on both sides. And so, but I mean, I don't know, I'm not up to date with this, but over the course of really the post-financial crisis all the way to 2016, 2017, when the capital controls from China became significant, the vast majority of investment actually to Europe and the US was in M&A, and it was non-state Chinese firms acquiring not strategic assets, acquiring real estate and like other things, right? And so so there's like these logics are just really different. And really, I mean, if I can only just say one thing about it, it's that when you look at the data sets you're using, whether it's the American Enterprise China Tracker or all these things, look at how those data are constructed, because it's often not as high quality as we might expect it to be. But
And on dispute settlement, just quickly, I think there is a rise in Chinese firms' use of investor state dispute settlement, but the numbers are still so small. And particularly dispute settlement against African sovereigns remains a very limited phenomenon. So I don't think we have enough data to draw conclusions on that. The other thing that I just throw out for the audience's awareness is certainly should the state lose, the taxpayer dollars which are at stake. So simply the sensitivity for foreign relations standpoint might also counsel why we perhaps see fewer of these cases being brought in the African context. So I don't think you'd be able to tease that out from the data quite that.
great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Is that about right? Oh, one or two? Okay, so we'll go to Bob and then
Always been fair. One quick question. Another. The Foxconn picture was revealing. Would you expect a similar outcome for Arizona for Taiwan Semiconductor? Or if God is that they can't make money in Arizona? The argument is I want to take down people on uncontrolled expectations. And I wonder what the expectations were. So my understanding is, mentioned this, that American aid, we don't do it. The Chinese are building roads. Second, my understanding is that they're building roads faster, more efficiently, it's done than say World Bank, which had both nowadays. So that in the end, the road got built. And there wasn't other expectation that led to failed expectation. And maybe it was job, I need that word, maybe. Maybe it was just, it didn't get there. Just say failed expectation. Oh, I didn't get.
Should I take this now?
Let's just have, maybe Blake, you could ask your question real quick and then we'll have Margaret wrap it up. Not allowed.
Definitely you guys remember that. Well, I'm a senior student. My name is Blake. I'm a senior student at HBS MBA. So like we talked about the broader how sort of African nations see sort of externalizing their risk projects and China projects. Wondering if over this research or other types of research, you sort of the influences of Chinese FDI and US FDI like on each other. Like for instance, if China FDI comes in, does that sort of provoke a response from the US, especially not only in sort of greenfield like infrastructure projects, but also when Chinese companies or Chinese firms or politicians try to buy technology and things like that, and they like. Do you also collect maybe responses on that as well? What are the responses that you see?
Good questions. I think the same thing will happen in Arizona, except that there's too much pressure now on that fab to work. I think that you'll have it continue to be bolstered, even if by hook or by crook, politicians will keep that going. No, again. Maybe. So on the unmet expectations, I think, our view is so on infrastructure projects, most of them are done with aid, and we don't see unmet expectations on aid. We see it on foreign investment. So on the kinds of projects that we're looking at, sadly, this is all during COVID. There's nothing I'd like better. Maybe when you go to Africa on your next project, you can ask people these questions. We haven't really been able to dig into that, and the data, the surveys don't talk about that. My sense is, though, if you sort of follow it anecdotally through press reports, you see a lot of the disappointment has to do with a lack of jobs that are created, not so much because China's importing labor, which I think is largely an overstated argument, but because often, like the Foxconn thing, they've scaled down, or they just haven't grown as fast as the hopes would be. Right? I think often is the case, right? Or it didn't solve everybody's problems the way politicians said it was going to solve our problems and make our community rich, and and bring in other companies and have a ripple effect to develop. Like in downtown Washington, you build the Verizon Center and it'll have a ripple effect and totally transform it. Well, it kind of worked there, but usually it doesn't work when you build new stadiums like north of Atlanta, right? Right. Okay. On this question. No, we don't. I don't have any information about it. I think what our going in understanding is that most of these companies are making investments for commercial reason, right? So you may find them clustered together because there's a specific, the obvious example would be minerals. You have resources in one place, and so you're going to get both companies wanting to go there to the extent that there is a demand for that industry, right? Well, in resources, the Chinese are doing that more. You don't see as much US, but you do see competitive investment from Russia. So, for example, in services, it tends to be in the cities, and you see both companies, both countries having their companies go there, but largely, again, it seems for commercial reasons, not for direct competition with each other. So.
So before I close, just a reminder again, for those of you who may come a little bit late, that next week's session will be at 9 o'clock AM Eastern, 9 o'clock in Beijing. Our guest speaker will be Ma Jun, the director of the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, speaking on Can China meet its green targets, with our commentator being Professor Dan Schrag of Harvard's Season Kennedy School. So please join. And this will be again only on Zoom. So just wanted to remind everybody, we will not have a physical presence here. So please join me in thanking Professor Pearson, Professor Rittmeyer for a fascinating discussion. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.